Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 38. Today's guest is writer Brandon Taylor. Hey, so I hope this isn't too much of a bother, but I need to ask you lovely listeners for something. So, a big part of this show, or, really just a big thing in general for me, is to try to find a way to give back to the artistic and literary communities that I love. It's not really an exaggeration to say that these communities have improved my life a lot, not just by bringing all the amazing work into the world and into my life, but also more directly and personally, I can say with certainty that every success I've ever had as an artist has only come about because someone else has helped me, whether that's critiquing my work or telling me about a show that I should submit to or giving me advice or, even just plain old encouragement. The amount of kindness and support that more established artists have given me over the years it's an astonishing thing to me. And more than that, it's something that I see happening all the time around me in so many different ways. And I want to be able to give some of that back. So, of course, I love getting the chance to help promote people's work through this show and on social media, and that's great. But I really want to do something more than that, something more direct. And the idea that I've had is to run a regular series of giveaways through this show where I buy work from guests, maybe prints, from visual artists or books, if it's a writer, and, or whatever. And then I turn around and give that work away to a listener or to a group of listeners. It's not a whole lot, but it winds up being a little more money in the pocket of an artist who could use it, money that they can use to support their practice. And it's putting a little more art and beauty out into the world by giving it to you. So the thing is, I need your help to be able to do that. Right now, this show costs me a lot more than what I bring in via donations. And, I want to stress that that is not just fine. That is actually great. It is a gift to be in a position where I can do something I love as much as this show. I'm very lucky, and I know that. This show really is a labor of love, and it is always one of the highlights of any week that I get to be able to do it. And I'm going to keep doing it as long as I'm able. But I want to do more, and for that, I need some help from you folks. So, I ran some numbers, and I figured out that if I can hit $150 a month in donations, that would be enough for me to cover all of the expenses for the show, with enough left over to hold a giveaway every other month. And then at that point, there'd be nothing left over to, put in the bank. I wouldn't be making any money off of it. But the point here isn't for me to make money. It's to, do something for someone else. So, if you're into this idea, if you like what I've done so far with the show and you're able to spare a buck or two per month, please consider subscribing to my Patreon campaign. It's at patreon.com/sakeriver. There's a link in the show notes, and you can find all the information about different goal levels, to be able to do giveaways every other month, then every month, then every other week. And there's different rewards for different donation levels. Just think about it. Okay, so enough of that. Thanks for sticking with me through all that. Now, how about we get to the show? All right, so as I mentioned, the guest today is Brandon Taylor. Brandon is a writer. He has written some of my favorite recent short stories and essays. He is the assistant editor of Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, and he is a Ph.D. candidate in biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he was recently accepted into the prestigious Iowa Writers Workshop MFA program. He has a truly excellent tiny letter, which, if you don't know what that is, it's an email newsletter service, which in his case he uses. He sends out personal essays every week or two, and they're just fantastic. Honestly, Brandon is one of my favorite writers out there right now, and I'm very glad to call him my friend, and I'm so pleased to bring you this conversation. So let's just jump in, shall we? Here is my conversation with Brandon Taylor. So how are you today?
I'm doing okay. It's been a bit of a long day. Day, but good.
You seems like you have a lot of long days.
That's true. So it's just sort of par for the course, but, hopefully not for too much longer.
Yeah. So, I was going to start with a really bad joke, and then I thought better of it. I thought that I would spring on you that we would start with your deep and abiding love for the Harry Potter series and go from there. But then I realized that I'm not actually funny, so I didn't know if I could pull that off.
Oh, I think you could. I think you could.
But anyway, I'm really glad to finally have the chance to talk with you, not quite in person, but at least in real time. You know, of course, that I'm a huge fan of your work. And so, you know, I'm pretty thrilled to get the chance. I was actually just this afternoon, I was reading another one of your stories, which I have several of them saved in my reading queue, but I have so little time for reading that I haven't had a chance to get to all of them yet. But the one I was reading this afternoon was We're Just People.
Ah.
And you know, as I do with all of your stories and tiny letters and everything, it was really great. I loved it so much.
Oh, thank you. That's my space gaze story, as I've been calling it on Twitter.
Yeah. I was really interested to see what it was going to be like after that description, and it's still totally a Brandon Taylor story, and I love it just as much as I love the other Brandon Taylor stories that I've read.
That's fascinating to me. And I don't even, people say that to me often. I feel like my branding is so intense that people are like, yep, that's a Brandon. And I'm like, what does that even mean?
Well, I mean, so I was thinking about your writing as I was, you know, trying to think about, you know, where to start. And I haven't read a ton of your stories. I've read all of your tiny letters, but what I was thinking about the three stories of yours that I have read are this last one, We're Just People, and then Freets and Run. And there's this quality to your writing that is, it's very, like your prose has a lyrical quality to it that is, you know, very captivating. But what really ends up sticking with me is that there's something about, at least with these three stories, this sort of current of people not really communicating. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm deeply interested in the way that people say both what they don't really mean to say and somehow manage to avoid saying the thing that they want or need to say. And I'm always interested in the ways that conversations float in and around these various roadblocks we put up for ourselves. Yeah, so that makes sense to me that would be a sort of central issue in my work.
Yeah, and it's something that, I don't know, there's something about, you know, the inability to connect, you know, there's something sort of like wonderfully tragic about it. And even though it's sort of also this really sort of mundane kind of tragedy, you know, like it's so common that I think maybe it can get overlooked, but then when you really look at it, it's got this real poignancy to it. I don't know. I really dig it.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm also really drawn to that in movies and in stories I read and in novels, and everything that I gravitate toward, you know, are these sort of micro tragedies that happen in and around everyday life. And I love those sort of very quiet movies. And my roommate is always telling me when we're watching movies together that, you know, Brandon, you never pay attention to like the main plot. You're always interested in like the devastated people sort of standing in the background of most movies. And I'm like, I know, but that's where the real invention's happening. You know, like that's where the real work is happening. And a story is always just sort of just off center of where most people seem to be looking. And I don't know if that's because as like a queer kid growing up, I had to sort of thrust myself wherever I could into stories, and that was the only space left for me was sort of in the margins or in the background, you know. And so I was drawn to these sites of invention and imagination even as a kid. Like all my favorite characters are kind of the minor characters from Disney movies or the villains, because the hero's journey is always very fleshed out, but villains are often left sort of sketchily drawn. And so you can, if you're a sort of young person who doesn't see themselves, you can kind of enter into those spaces and invent and create. And so I guess that's always been my ethos as like a person who engages with stories, is I'm always drawn to those little spots on the edge of things that no one else is really paying attention to.
That's cool. That's so much cooler than anything I've ever said about any of the stuff that I read when I was a kid. I don't know. There's this. I feel like there's a thing that writers do in particular, like at least good writers, where I feel like when I listen to writers talk about the stories that they love, a lot of times I guess it makes sense that writers would have a greater ability to fill in the blanks and a greater sort of predilection towards wanting to fill in the blanks. I don't think everybody does that though.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until recently, when I'm sort of watching movies with my other friends and they're like, no, that's like, what are you doing? Like, there is nothing else to engage with beyond the thing that we have been given. And I'm like, oh, I see. Like, you have no interest in inventing on the margins with me. I mean, sometimes when I'm watching movies with my roommate or whatever, I sort of invent whole narratives and sort of supply the dialogue over the movie. And that becomes the funny part of the watching experience with him, is just like laughing at all the silly voices I can do talking over characters on television. Because that's often like way more interesting than whatever some straight white man has written and had paid for to be filmed for television and public consumption.
Yeah. I always particularly enjoy it when I'm able to catch you live tweeting a movie that you're watching. It's a particular joy, getting to follow along with the Brandon movie watching experience. And I particularly like it when you're watching Jane Austen movies.
Oh my gosh. Those are my favorite. There's just like it's so rich. Like, it's just such an experience, I think. Even watching those movies, sort of all of the subtle like glancing going on and just entering those spaces and just making everyone super queer and sort of updating it to today's like slang terms. It's always funny to like cross hatch these things together, I find.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny too, though, because like a lot of this stuff, it's you like updating it makes it. There's a humor to it, but it's like it still fits. Like a lot of these things don't really change that much the way that people interact with each other, and Austen really was, that was what she was into. So it's great. So when I was thinking about these stories of yours that I've read that. And I said this to you before when I was reading those other two stories, that the way that everything sort of happens, it's interesting to hear you talk about movies this way, because it puts these stories into a sort of a different context for me, because of the way that in those two stories, Freets and Run, and I still haven't read the third one yet, and I'm looking forward to it, but how everything happens on the level of subtext, like the words that you're reading are not actually the story at all. And I can't think of very many people, if anyone, who have done that as well as you do it. So, I don't know. Hearing you talk about that other stuff, like, it's actually kind of exciting to me to get to. It almost feels like what you're doing is providing that experience that you do with stories and movies, and allowing other people a way to do that as well, which is not something that had occurred to me before. But it's, I'm feeling very proud of myself for having thought of that just now.
No, that I hadn't thought about it that way either, except in the sense, you write the things that interest you, and you write in the way that feels most alive to you, and you hope to meet that animating energy where it is. And I always find that when I'm writing away from that space, when I'm writing away from that animating force of just what drives my work, it always comes out very dead and slow and not interesting. But when I am kind of being a bit more playful, and when I am sort of inventing on the spot and riffing and operating at the level of subtext, I feel like that's when I'm having the most fun writing, and those are often the most successful stories. So I mean, that makes sense to me that there would be this kind of synergy between the way that I watch movies and television and read novels and the way that I write, right? Because we're always kind of taking and stealing the things that we most enjoy and using it in our own work.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that when you're writing that it tends to be, in general, a more spontaneous kind of thing? I mean, I know you've talked about with your tiny letter that one of the things you enjoy about it is that you can kind of, that it has sort of a dashed off quality, which, by the way, it feels pretty polished to me, but I wonder about your fiction writing practice, that like that doesn't, it never feels dashed off in the slightest, but I wonder when you're writing it, does it just sort of happen, or does it take a lot of, do you end up laboring over it a lot?
Oh no, I don't usually labor. I'm like a pretty lazy person. And so what I normally do is I wait until something feels, because because of, I am a graduate student in biochemistry and I work really ridiculous hours. I don't have a lot of time to write. And so I have to write very quickly and on very limited time. And so what ends up happening is I go weeks without writing. And then over the course of one lunch break, I write like 5,000 words. And then I sometimes revisit it and sometimes just polish the typos and send it out. Like I don't spend a lot of time laboring or thinking about the story because I've let the subconscious work on it, I guess. I mean, I'm often thinking about lines from stories, and I'm often thinking about, oh, wouldn't that be funny if I did that? Or wouldn't that be, like, if I see a very attractive young man on the bus and I'm like, what's his life like? And I sort of try to provide him with an interesting story in my head, and then 3 days later, I sit down and I try to write a story. What I try not to do is I try not to force myself. I try not to force it out. I try not to force it into a shape, because that always ends up feeling very dead to me. I mean, backtracking to the tiny letter, there were a couple of times when I would sit down to write that letter and I would try to do something very intellectual and very smart. Like, I'm going to write about math and differential equations and tie that to something else. And like those letters would always feel boring or stiff. And I was like, the best letters seem to be when I just spend 45 minutes writing and I fix the typos as best I can and I send it out. And those seem to be the letters that, people are able to meet and to feel animated by, and it resonates with them. And so I've tried to keep that ethos, I guess, through all of my work, is do what feels alive. Don't sweat it too much. Like, don't take it too seriously, but do try to write something that feels alive and good and moves on the page. Like, that's my metric. Like, does it move when I read it? Like, does it come alive? And if not, then, it's going into the trash bin for sure.
It's funny, I find that I have a pretty similar pattern when I write, that usually by the time I'm ready to sit down and write something, I've been thinking about it for long enough that I kind of have it all in my head already and it just comes out. But I find that I top out at about maybe 2,500 words is about what I can manage. And only essays. Like, I've never been able to figure out how to write stories. And I've always thought that I've always felt like it was sort of something holding me back was my inability, or at least unwillingness, to plan out a piece of writing more. Mm-hmm. But, it seems to work out pretty well. But when I do what I do, but it really seems to be strictly limited in scope. Like, I can't really manage something 5 or 10 or 20,000 words. It seems to be beyond me. I don't know.
I mean, I had that feeling about novel writing for a very long time. I still have that feeling about novel writing. I felt like, oh, I'm definitely a short story writer. I only want to write short stories. And because, my favorite writer is Mavis Gallant, who writes like 40-page stories, I thought, yeah, that seems the way to go. And it just felt like writing something that's 40,000 words or 90,000 or 100,000 words just felt like impossible. Like, how do you keep the entire architecture of something that big, like, in your mind? It just feels impossible. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the differences between fiction and nonfiction, right? Like, with an essay, it is possible to kind of write it in one continual burst, and the way that an essay moves is different from the way that piece of fiction moves, because fiction has all of these sort of internal deviations and weird structures and things that need to come up here but go down there. And pieces of fiction, not that they're more complicated than nonfiction, but their structure is very different. And so I think it's more difficult to like just sit down and bang it out, like it is harder. I mean, fiction is much harder than writing my tiny letter, which has a different set of pressures and expectations. But yeah, I do think about the spontaneous nature of essay versus fiction and their structures and why one feels harder than the other to just sort of write on the fly, I think.
Well, and that sort of, it's interesting, I was thinking a lot about your tiny letter, and also, I've read several of the pieces that you've written for, like, I think you've had essays on, I can't remember the names of the sites, but like there was the one that you wrote about there's no secret to writing about people who do not look like you.
Yeah, on LitHub. That's
LitHub.
on LitHub.
Yeah. And like, so I was thinking about your fiction versus your personal writing versus your sort of nonfiction essay writing, and it was, I think there, when I read all of those pieces of yours, there's a definite like continuity of voice between them, but they obviously do really different things, and it's something that I think about a lot when I think about different ways of engaging creatively, trying to figure out what one thing does well and doesn't do well versus another form or a different discipline. And I was sort of wondering, like, what it is about each form that attracts you and what you feel like, you get out of one or can do with one that you can't do with the other,
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I hadn't thought about the sort of, I guess, not critical work, but I guess like cultural critique work that I do as separate from my personal essays, but I guess they are, right? Like, yeah, I guess with fiction, I'm most interested in relationships and taking them to their most extreme. And I feel that I don't know, my fiction feels like I'm doing like an experiment, like I'm taking the set of conditions and I'm putting them under a set of constraints and I'm seeing what comes out of it. It's more of an experiment to me. And with the personal essays, that feels more like an excavation, like I'm taking some part of my experience in my life and I'm just kind of unfurling it and really looking at it from all these different sides. And I feel like my other nonfiction feels like it's taking something outside of myself and bringing it closer to me and examining it from all these other angles. And so my other nonfiction feels like it's originating outside of myself. My personal essays feel like their origin is within me, and my fiction feels like it is a sort of hybrid of the two, where I'm taking maybe something that happened to me or something that originated outside of me, and I am sort of bringing my personality and my interest to bear on that topic and controlling all of the outcomes and seeing what happens.
Yeah. That word that you use, excavation, is something, it's interesting. Like when I think about, like for myself as an artist, as a writer, like, it was something that I've spent some time thinking about, this sort of, being an engineer, I'm sort of, I sort of have a natural inclination to want to categorize things. And so I have this theory about like two big sort of schools when it comes to how someone approaches a creative endeavor, and that there be people who build things and people who explore or discover things. And I gotta say, like, there's something kind of amazing to me about someone who can do both. You know, like for myself, when it comes to either writing or photography, I find that I have a pretty easy time when it comes to observing something and presenting it to an audience. And you know, like in photography, you might have like a street photographer or people who do like what I do, and versus someone who really constructs a scene. You know, somebody like I don't know, Gregory Heisler or something like that. Somebody who's really like, you know, building something where there wasn't something before. And that is just not something I've ever been able to do, either in my writing or in my photography. And I had this impression for a while that like most people either do one or the other, but then I find people like you who do both, and it's kind of just befuddling.
Oh, big if true, I guess. I don't know. You say that I can do both, but I often feel like, oh no, I definitely am not good at this construction thing. I'm so bad at it. I should just sort of stick to.
Well, I'm sure that's why they accepted you into Iowa, right? Is because you're bad at it?
You know, that acceptance into Iowa was, for me, the first real validation I've had of my fiction writing in a long, long time. Because I write fiction, and that's sort of how I primarily identify as like a fiction writer. But, you know, no one shares fiction pieces on social media, but they love to share a harrowing personal essay.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, oh man, I'm going to be an essayist. Oh no. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I just, as a fiction writer, I'm like, no, I write fiction. I only do one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're like, no, we'll take you, I'm like, oh my gosh, I am a fiction writer. And I guess it's not good to base validation on outside things, but it really changed my perception of myself. And I'm like, no, I can identify as a fiction writer, and my fiction is good, and it does sort of stand on its own. But I guess I sort of have some lingering insecurity about my ability to construct narratives and make them compelling and make them interesting and send them out into the world. I know. But I guess every fiction writer has that, right? Like every fiction writer is always like, oh, this thing I've created is not good. It is not authentic. It isn't working. And then, you know, they win a Pulitzer or whatever.
Yeah.
Like maybe they feel a little more secure. But I think this is an interesting distinction, this sort of constructing of things and then just sort of the observation of it. And so then the site of work and observational writing becomes not novelty, but what can you pull out of this observation, and what are you saying about this thing, and what are you moved by in it? And I think that in itself is a form of making and building, I guess. Like you're sort of activating the thing that you're seeing by observing it and animating it and doing something interesting with it.
Yeah, well, one hopes anyway. I mean,
yes, that's true.
I mean, I can say for sure that the personal writing that you do, I mean, it moves me, and I know that it moves other people as well. I know people were very taken with several of your tiny letters, and in particular the one, I think it was called Hours. Made the Catapult best of list or something.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah,
it did. I was really struck. Yeah, I know. I was really touched when Nicole wanted to run that letter, and I'm like, oh, I was just sort of riffing on this ridiculous habit I have of staying up very late at night and sort of trying to make sense of it and track it, back to my family. I guess all my tiny letters are me trying to reconcile this isolation I felt for a very long time and this dissimilarity I felt with my family. And as I'm getting older, seeing these parallels and these resonances and being like, oh, we are not that dissimilar after all. Oh no, how do I make sense of this life I'm living?
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think something that's so compelling about personal writing in general, but like especially your writing, is like when it's done really well. And I think I think of people like you or like Helena Fitzgerald, where you will write these things where they're simultaneously very, like, they're very, I want to, the right word isn't coming to me. I want to say personal, but that's not the right word. They're like specific to you, and they're sort of staking out in a lot of ways your uniqueness. You know, like when I read your essays, one half of my reaction is thinking about the ways that you and I are different from each other, how we're not the same person, but at the same time, simultaneously thinking about how all of these things that you're writing are so resonant for me and remind me so much of experiences that I've had, even though they're not the same experiences. And being able to have both of those in your head at the same time, I don't think that's something that everybody is capable of doing. It's something different.
Yeah, I find that I agree. Not that I'm on the same level as Helena Fitzgerald,
Stop.
who is beyond just amazing. But I agree. The best personal writing, the writing that I most resonate with, is the writing that isn't just kind of looking inward, but is looking inward in a way that is also universal. I think back to my freshman comp class where the teacher told us to be thinking always about the so what factor. Like, so when the reader's reading the piece, they're going to ask, like, why am I reading this? So what? Who cares? And so when I'm writing these like personal essays, I'm always like, okay, but who cares? Like, who cares about the sort of abuse you endured, or who cares about these very sad things that are mostly sad only to you and your set of friends? And so then I start to do the work of digging into it and really trying to hold it up and look at it and turn it over. And I think a lot of people relate to that, the looking at your experience and trying to figure out like how you feel about it and what you think about it, and how it is not universal. I don't ever really think about the universal, but I try to think about what is important about this experience and what did I learn from it and how did I learn from it and what is it doing to either inform or deform the shape of my life and my experience. I think that's what I'm always writing toward, and I think I'm successful sometimes and sometimes I'm not, but I'm always trying to think about those things.
I don't think anybody is ever, I don't think any real artist is ever successful enough in their own eyes, and I think realistically that's a good thing, right? Because it keeps you hungry and it keeps you trying to do better. I think when I read your work, first of all, the kinds of insights that you come to in some of these pieces are uncommon. They're really non-obvious. And that you do so consistently is impressive. But, another thing I was thinking about, and this is something that I sort of struggle with my own work, because my own work tends to be sort of very personal, at times confessional, where to me it can feel very self-absorbed, this thing that I'm doing, where, like who am I to why should anybody care about this thing that I experienced? Why does anybody want to look at these pictures or read this poem or whatever? It can feel very solipsistic, but when I read people's work like yours and a few other people, what it really strikes me as not that at all, that it's actually that there's a real generosity to it in that you are allowing the reader to reckon with themselves in a way, and you're doing that by sharing pieces of yourself, and that there, I think there is a real generosity to that,
Yeah, well, that's I will reflect that and say that no, I feel the same way when I read work that speaks to me. There is a space for me in it when I'm reading it, and I feel like the person isn't talking at me, but they're sort of saying, they're sort of turning over their own experiences and their own thoughts, and I'm there to witness it, and it's triggering my own. Like, there's space in that experience of reading that work and engaging with it that is allowing me to think about my own stuff simultaneously. And even if it isn't the same, and even if it is very, very different, being able to locate myself inside of a piece of writing that is doing some real work, I always feel, I think generosity is the best word for that. Like when a writer has created room for you in their work. And often bad personal writing can often feel closed as opposed to open in this way that we're discussing, right? Like, it can feel very closed and fenced in and, just inwardly looking. And it feels like, well, what is the point of all of this internal looking? Like, why are you doing that? And I think open is always what I most respond to anyway. Open work.
Yeah. And I and then another thing that I really respond to with your work, and this is common through all three types of your writing, is that you have, you even talk about this on Twitter sometimes, how important it is to you to resist the reductive take. And I find that your writing, whether it's fiction, cultural critique, or personal writing, really engages with nuance in a way that, like, this is just sort of, I'm just sort of thinking about this now, and I kind of wonder if, you being a scientist has some bearing on your ability to sort of analyze and sort of find the core of these things, to sort of, there's something about, like, that piece that you wrote for LitHub was surprising, not in the subject matter, the overall topic, because a lot of people are writing about representation in fiction, and writing about things like diversity panels and sensitivity readers and things like that. But your take on it was really a lot more nuanced and a lot more, like, I actually pulled out a quote from it. There was a thing where you were talking about seeing problematic stories as the result of a moral failing, and how you aren't willing to say that all the time. And I don't know, I think there's something like a clarity of analysis to some of this that I guess I do kind of wonder if the science part kind of feeds that, or maybe both the science and the writing come from the same internal impulse. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling at this point.
Maybe so. No, I think a lot about that too. But but for me, yes, maybe the science does aid, because it's getting a degree in critical thinking essentially is what a Ph.D. is. But for me, what has been very, very informative is, reading the work of people like Alexander Chee or Roxane Gay, people who trouble very complacent narratives, and people who are always interested in resisting the reductive take and resisting the kind of blanket narratives. And so when I sit, because of where I sit on Twitter, I'm at the intersection of all these really interesting conversations all of the time. I'm just often like, well, you're being reductive, or you're being simplistic. It's not that simple. And so in watching Roxane Gay interact with people on Twitter and in her writing, she's always so resistant to being told what she's saying, and being told that what she's saying is simple. And so she's like, that's not what I'm saying. That's simplistic. It's not that easy. It's not that simple. And so that really emboldened me to do that in my work, to say, it's not that easy. It's not that sort of simple of a story. And so, like, let's really crack this thing open and do the work of interrogating all of the nuance, because in many ways, the internet is a fantastic tool and I love it and it saved my life. But what it tends to do is flatten narratives. Like, it takes very complicated stories, and because of the way internet writing often happens is, like, all these nuances get flattened. And you get these very kind of quippy write-ups about complicated issues, and it leads to all sorts of trouble. And the last thing I want to do is write anything that someone can just pull a quote out of context and then say, oh, Brandon said this very problematic thing. And so I'm always at every step of the way trying to write things to their full nuance and to resist having these stories flattened and simplified. And LitHub has been a really, great place for me to do that. A Catapult has given me a place to do that. And I'm always trying to do that in my tiny letter, trying to resist being reduced and simplified because, life is messy, and these issues of representation or diversity or life and trauma, all of these are messy, complicated factors. And so, maybe science does make me more patient or willing to engage with messy things and messy ideas. But it's really, the work of people like Roxane Gay and Alexander Chi who have given me models to do that in my writing.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely adore both of their writings, so I can see that. Queen of the Night was just an amazing book.
Oh my God, it was astounding in every way. Yes, my favorite book of last year, I think. Just perfection.
I feel like I could keep going forever on all this stuff, but we are we're at about 40 minutes now, so we should probably break real quick and then come back for the second segment. So
okay.
So for the second segment, I always ask my guests to bring a topic of their own, which can be anything, anything that you find interesting. So what would you like to talk about tonight?
I would like to talk about expectation, and I mean that in all senses of the word. I've been thinking a lot about expectation because as you know, I've made this big decision in my life to leave my Ph.D. and go get an MFA. And that's raised a lot of expectations, like expecting what my advisor's going to say when I tell her, or expecting what my last few months as a PhD student are going to mean, or expecting, what's around the corner at Iowa. And then maybe expecting my future to change in some way, and how it is both thrilling but also deeply terrifying.
Yeah. There's something about the not knowing that there's an excitement to it. I don't know. I find different people are sort of more or less comfortable with these things. And even for myself, like sometimes I want to stay in the not knowing, but most of the time I just want to get through it and get it over with. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I am not someone who likes to tarry in the uncertain. I spent so much of my life being uncertain about things and not sure how other people were even perceiving me, or how I should be perceiving things, or, if there was going to be food in the house or the lights were on. So much of my life was spent being anxious and uncertain and not knowing what to expect next, that now I'm just like, no, I don't like waiting. I don't like expecting things. I don't like to forecast. I just like to be in the now, but that's impossible. You can't just exist solely in the present. And there's also this other, I guess, interpretation of expectation, which is the thing that people put on you, right? Like they expect that you will do this and this and this, and how expectation quickly turns to obligation, which is something else that I've been experiencing and feeling very, very stressed out by, and just having no idea how to manage any of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's something, the whole idea of obligation, is something that I've been my therapist and I have been making a lot out of it. But I kind of think that phenomenon might be like the central aspect of most relationships. And it's only recently that I've started to understand that maybe that doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, that seems like a fanciful concept for a very far away land in which obligation is not the sort of main reason I do things for people. I mean, I don't know. I often do things out of a sense of obligation, but it's like often a gleeful feeling. Like, yes, you're my friend. I'm obligated to do this thing for you, but I like it because I like you. But it's not always so happy.
Yeah, I find for myself that so much of what I do is out of obligation, either to a person or to just a general sense of what I'm supposed to be like, of being responsible or being a good person or whatever, and that can very quickly and easily transform into resentment, which can be strange if it's not directed at somebody else, like it just having some sort of nebulous sense of resentment towards the universe, I guess. I don't know. But it's not great.
I know that feeling very well. When I was young and people found out that I was sort of good at school, the expectation was that I would go on to be a lawyer or a doctor. And people in my family, outside of my family, people on the street, black people in particular, would say, well, you're going to do it for us. You gotta reach back and help others. You gotta get out. You have to get out. And I just began to feel like, oh, so this isn't for me. This is for this sort of larger program of racial enrichment. And at first I thought, well, yeah, I have to save my people. But then I began to think like, oh, come on, but what if I don't want to get an A in this class? Or what if I don't want to be the best that I can be? What if I don't want to have to be the representative for my people in this very, very white space? And I began to resent it for a long time, because I felt like I was being forced to play a role or to act a part. And I mean, even tonight, I was at a speaker, and when I told her that I was leaving the PhD, she like gripped my arm, and she said, "No, you can't do that. You can't quit. Like, you have to get it. Like, you have to get the degree. There are so few of us." And I thought, oh, like even now, I'm like going to be 28 years old, and I'm still not allowed to be, the master of my own destiny. I'm not allowed to self-determine. And so again, it's like these expectations are placed on me, Mm-hmm. A few months ago, I had an interaction with a custodian in the department, because I worked very strange hours, and the custodians were cleaning the lab. And he said, "Brandon." And I said, "Hi." I did not know his name. And he told me that he knew my name because he'd seen my picture on a department poster, and that he's like, "I see you every night and I wish you good luck, because there aren't that many of us here." And then he like went away, and I was like, oh, this sort of strange janitor has like put his expectations and his hopes on my shoulders because I'm supposed to succeed and go on and be a good representative. And I'm just like, when does it end? Like, when am I free of these expectations and obligations, and when am I ever allowed to be just a neutral person in the world? And maybe the answer to that is like never. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm turning 38 this year, and I can tell you, at least in my experience, I have yet to see the end of it.
Oh no!
I'm sorry. But I mean, I kind of think that it's just at some point it's just a process of like just having to claim it, like, because at some, like, nobody's ever really going to give it to you, you just have to take it for yourself. But that's not something that's super comfortable for me. And it's interesting, like hearing you talk about that, like I feel like I can relate. It's not the same thing. Like the Asian experience and the Black experience are not at all the same thing, but there is something about like there's a something resonant about that, and hearing about having to reflect well on your people is something that I think certainly I grew up with, and I think a lot of Asian people grow up with. Which, representation in the sciences and technology or in law and medicine is not really something that Asian people suffer from, but there's still, for some reason, this enforced narrative of, you have to, you have to do everything and you have to make us look good kind of thing. I kind of think, I don't know, for me when I was younger, there was something about being good at school and excelling and meeting that expectation felt really good at times. And then when I got to college and sort of got, kicked in the ass and realized that I wasn't quite as hot shit as I thought I was in high school, that felt really good too. I don't know. There's something about either choosing to meet an expectation or choosing not to, that either way can feel really great or feel really shitty. And I'm not really sure exactly what makes the difference.
Yeah, no, I think about that too, the ways in which so I had a really, really rough first year, 2 years in graduate school. And every time I, got back like a bad grade on an assignment, I'm like, I'm just making it harder for the next Black person who's coming through the door. Like, I'm just reaffirming all of these people's biases against me. And they think that, I'm already provisional within this space and they think that I don't deserve to be here. And so I just felt like every time I struggled, my struggle wasn't because of my own issues, that these people were intuiting that, oh, I'm struggling because I'm Black, and I felt like I wasn't allowed to have my own experience be my experience and that not to affect the fortunes of the next Black person through the door. And so again, I'm like, no, I have to do better so that it's easier for that next person, because I mean, I've been the only Black person in my department for 4 years and it's, like 100 people, something like that. Mm-hmm. And so, I keep thinking about, well, now I'm leaving and the next person who comes isn't going to have someone here, just like I didn't have a person here when I came. And so I'm just perpetuating all of these biases and expectations. And it is, I think about it a lot more now that I'm older. I feel less resentment and I feel not at peace with it, but, like it is what it is. And this is the system and these are the circumstances. And I have to be responsible and engage with these expectations one way or another. And I feel like I'm still grappling with it. Like I still don't know, how to feel about it. And do I get to have my own feelings about it? And do I get to have my own experience? Or is it just, I have to represent my people to these other people who really have no interest in seeing my experience as particular and granular and specific,
Yeah.
And why does, I was going to say, why does that, their problem become my problem?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, because, at the end of the day, like your responsibility is only what you choose for it to be, but then that doesn't feel satisfying most of the time. And the truth and the shitty truth is that, if you are, if you're not part of, I mean, I guess I just say it, like if you're not like a white man, like you're not, like you don't really get to be just you. You always have to be in relation to your group, whatever that is. And that sucks. But like also, like sometimes I go back and forth, like, cause sometimes I feel like that it's like, that's only my problem insofar as I choose for it to be my problem, but then also, feeling like, I don't know, like if I have the ability to articulate things or teach white people things or, make things better for other people, that maybe I should, but to me, maybe the end of it is just that it doesn't matter what you do as long as it's your choice.
Yeah. No, I think I think that's what it boils down to, right? The other thing is just like, who am I to sort of think that I'm representing the people? It's like, it's what hubris to think that. But on the other hand, it's like, the kinds of conversations I get involved in, people do treat me like the spokesperson for all Black people. And I'm
Yeah.
like, we're not all the same. We're not a monolith. We are all very particular people with particular experiences. I think about what Ted Chiang said when he was here. He said something like that when there is a non-white, non-male person in a story, people will act as though that person's identity is not neutral, as if it is like a charged entity, and that it needs to be justified or validated, like why they're there. And I think about that a lot in my own, like, very, very real life, is that when people talk to me sometimes and I say something about my experience, they act like I have to contextualize it for them, and that it can't just be my experience, that I just can't make a neutral statement. It has to be a statement about Black people or about the Black experience. And I'm like, no, I just don't like that kind of coffee. Like, that's not a Black people thing. That's just like a Brandon thing, and how unfair that is.
Yeah. It's shitty.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Expectation. I mean, it is a thrilling prospect. And at the same time, it is like all of these other things at the same time, like obligation and fear and dread. And I guess it's all just rooted in not knowing and uncertainty.
Yeah. It's interesting, you at the beginning, you said a thing that I had never really thought about, how, like, for myself, I'm usually just wanting to get past the expectation into the thing itself. And I had not really considered, how much of that might be influenced by my upbringing. But, like, there were things that you were saying about your upbringing where it was bringing to mind a lot of experiences that I had when I was younger. Like, when I was a kid, dealing with, the uncertainty of getting bullied a lot at school, or, when I was very young and, shortly after my parents got divorced, we didn't have a lot of money. So, my mom likes to tell a story of me talking to strangers in the grocery store line about how we couldn't afford better food this week. And it never really occurred to me to think about how that might have laid some kind of foundation for me not to be willing to engage with expectation in a positive way. But, like, now that I'm thinking about it, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. No, that really speaks to me too. The just unwillingness or just like the not wanting to sit in that uncertainty, or like I don't know, my primary interactions with expectation are ones of dread, just like dreading what's around the corner and waiting for the other shoe to drop, and just always expecting a negative outcome, because whenever there's been uncertainty in my life, it's always been like not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
What a bummer. That's such a downer note. That's not no. Okay. That's so negative. Man, that's so like my life. I always bring the downer. Like, that's just like my primary function.
Well, at least you're not there by yourself. I get that a lot as well. So
we're all in the doldrums. We're all in the doldrums. Alas.
So, I guess I might as well. The last question that I usually ask everyone, I try to ask everyone when I don't forget, is whether there is a piece of art or literature or some form of creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Oh, that's such a good question. A piece of art or literature. Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is an easy question. Kelly Reichardt's new movie, Certain Women, which is based on a short story collection by Miley Malloy, was a stunning piece of cinema. It's about these desperate women in the West, in Montana, and it it's three connected narratives, and it's just beautiful. It's full of all my favorite things. It's got great sweaters. It's really stark. There's beautiful natural surroundings, and it's women who don't want to give up anything, who are sort of bit by bit being forced to give up words or thoughts or love or affection to people who don't deserve it. And it is a stunning piece of work, and it just spoke to me artistically and emotionally and spiritually. It was, just a fantastic, and the book is also gorgeous, but the movie was, one of the best experiences I've had in cinema since maybe Moonlight, I think.
Wow, that's pretty high praise. So
it was, it's the best. I loved it.
All right. Well, I will definitely make sure to check that out then. I can definitely count on a recommendation from you. So, cool.
Ooh.
But anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I've been looking forward to it for quite some time. So,
me too. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so if you want to follow Brandon, you can do that on Twitter. You can find him there at Brandon LG Taylor, and there's a link in the show notes for that. I also highly recommend Brandon's Tiny Letter, which you can subscribe to at tinyletter.com/Brandon LG Taylor, and there's a link for that in the show notes as well. And, this is honestly one of the best things I get to read on a regular basis, and I always look forward to every new letter. They're just great. And that is our show. If you would like to get in touch with me, comment on the show, ask me a question, you can send me an email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. You can also follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. I mentioned our Patreon campaign at the top of the show, and if you want to support the show, we have a few different levels with different rewards. You can find more information about that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. And a donation in any amount is hugely appreciated. If you're not able to donate, you could also leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, or even, just help spread the word about the show on social media. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time I'll be talking with Dr. Becky Senf, the Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona, so be sure to come back for that one. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.